Okay, let's round this out. So we, I want us to consider the idea that in economies, okay, we talked about how there's so much trade going on. Um, there's this essay called "I Pencil," and it basically talks about all of the different things that have to happen for just one little pencil to be made. Um, everything is so connected. Um, that's always been the case, but especially now. Um, across the globe, all of these things are connected. We buy stuff from all sorts of nations, all sorts of other nations buy stuff from us. Um, what happens to the rich affects the poor. What happens to the poor affects the rich. What happens in the housing sector affects everything. What happens in all of these little industries affects everybody. And we're going to go way more into detail on that. Um, but there's a few takeaways that I want you to get just right off the bat. So one is that any sort of hard times or prosperity in one country or one sector of the economy is likely to spread to other places. Not too long ago, Greece was having a debt crisis, and everyone's like, well, who cares? Well, because that debt crisis in that country could spread to other countries because other places have loaned Greece money, and there's other countries that could also default on their debts, and all of this stuff can spread back to the United States. um, and we're really not in a place in history where it's easy to make everything in one country. There's resources different places. There's some industries that are just better set up in other countries. Um, so really, our fates are kind of tied together, and it's very easy to be tempted into policies that maybe say, "Oh well, let's not worry about what these other countries are doing," or "Let's not worry about this industry over here." Um, but all of these industries are very tied together. Um, and banks are tied into all sorts of different stuff. There's just so many different pieces of the economy where if one of them fails, there's big effects for everybody else, even the people who are maybe outside of that country or outside of that industry. So we have to be very careful about just saying, oh, well, that's not our problem. Because in a lot of cases, it will wind up being our problem at some point. The other thing I wanted to point out is that because of how many different economic actors there are, how many different businesses, how many different countries, how many different individuals, and how interconnected everything is, economic predictions are very, very difficult. Which a lot of people take a look at that and they go, well, why don't we even study this if these predictions are so hard? It's economic forecasting is kind of like forecasting the weather. Um, it's so complicated that getting things precise is very difficult. Um, like once a hurricane forms, meteorologists can kind of guess at where it's going to go. They've got a decent idea, but they can't tell you exactly, even though they've been studying these things for years and years and years. Um, with economics, it's similar. While we understand a lot of the mechanics of what goes on, and there's certain things that we can predict with certain degrees of accuracy, um, because of the way all of this stuff is so interconnected, it's really, really hard to make economic predictions. The last point I want to make is that economic theories must be tested. Um, this is a science. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it. Sometimes it just feels like, we're just talking about common sense stuff. But where science is concerned, common sense can get you into trouble. because something that seems to make sense, it seems to be completely logical, doesn't pan out whenever you actually study it up close. You go, oh, this thing that we thought was the case, you know, in the real world doesn't turn out like that. And so, to make economics a science, for us to not just say, well, here's a theory, and I'm pretty sure it's true because it just makes sense. We have to measure different economic variables. Okay, so we have to use measurement and observation. And that's where the math part comes in. I know some of you are not excited about the math part, but it's a necessary part because this is a science. Economists use a lot of different indicators. We're not going to look into every single indicator. Mr. McClung doesn't know every single indicator. There's a ton of them. But we're going to look at unemployment rate. We're going to look at, we're going to look at GDP, which is a measure of production. We talked about how production was really important, and CPI, which is a measure of price levels, helps us do inflation. Remember, we talked earlier about the difference between nominal variables and real variables, the ones that are based on like in dollars and the ones that are adjusted for inflation. Well, we have to understand what inflation is doing before we can adjust for that. Okay. These measures aren't perfect. You'll hear people criticize some of these measures, and with some justification. So some of the more boring parts of this class is when we kind of dig into these measurements and figure out, how do they measure this stuff? Like, are they just making up stuff? And, what are kind of the upsides and downsides of different ways of measuring these? And again, it can be a little tedious, but it's important to understand how these measurements work so that we can know where maybe they fall short or areas where they actually are going to perform well. So that is your helicopter view of this economics course. I hope you've learned a lot, even in the introduction. We're going to dive into all of these. So if you don't feel like you've understood everything, that's fine. We're going to kind of zoom in on each one of these and dig a little deeper.